Let's talk about solving quadratic equations. So we're talking about any quadratic. We're used to seeing it something like y equals 4x squared plus 2x minus 9. But instead of it being set equal to y now, we're going to have it set equal to a number, and we're actually solving for that variable x. And the quadratic formula is something that we can use to solve these types of equations. So what is the quadratic formula? X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of the quantity b squared minus 4ac, all of that divided by 2a. So take a second, make sure you carefully copy that down. Some important things to know. The quadratic formula allows you to find solutions for any quadratic equation. You've probably learned some different ways in the past that only work at certain times, like factoring only works when that quadratic is factorable. So this quadratic formula works at any time. The equation, though, has to be in standard form, and we know that that means it's in the form ax squared plus bx plus c, and then it has to be set equal to 0. Now, the part that's underneath the square root, that's called the discriminant. So this part right here, the b squared minus 4ac, that right there is what we call the discriminant. And we're going to talk about what the discriminant tells you here in a little bit as we walk through these notes a little bit further. So let's look at that first example. Solve using the quadratic formula. So let's check some things first. Is it in standard form? Yes, we have 3x squared plus 4x minus 8, so that's good. Is it set equal to 0? Yes, it is. So now we can start using the formula. So let's just determine what A, B, and C are first. So we know A is 3, B is positive 4, and we know C is going to be negative 8. So we're going to write all of this out in our formula. So we know that X will equal negative B. So since B is positive 4, it's going to be negative 4 plus or minus the square root of a quantity, and it's B squared. So 4 squared minus 4 times your A value, which is 3, times your C value, which is negative 8. And then all of that gets divided by 2 times A, and our A value again is 3. So our job is to simplify this. So we're going to start with what's under the square root, that discriminant. So I'm just going to kind of copy down step by step. We have negative 4 plus or minus the square root of, let's figure out what is 4 squared. Well, we know 4 squared is 16. So we're going to have, and I'll just kind of write it off to the side over here. We're going to have 16 minus the quantity, because we need to multiply, because multiplication happens before subtraction. We need to multiply 4 times 3 times negative 8. So 4 times 3, we know that's 12. 12 times negative 8 is negative 96. So we're subtracting this whole quantity here is negative 96. So 16 minus negative 96 is the same as 16 plus 96, which is 112. So our discriminant is 112. We can answer that question there. But we're not quite finished with the quadratic formula, right? We have to go through and we have to divide this by the quantity, the 2 times 3, which is 6. So we have negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 112 divided by 6. So that plus or minus basically means we're going to have two things happening. We're going to do negative 4 plus the square root of 112, and we'll divide that by 6. But then we'll also do negative 4 minus the square root of 112 and divide that by 6. So if we type each of these separately in our calculator, we do negative 4 plus the square root of 112. I normally hit enter here, and then I divide that by 6, and we're going to get decimals here. So it says round answers to the nearest hundredth. So let's see, if I type that in, I get 1.097. So to round to the nearest hundredth, that 7 is going to round that 9 up. So we're really going to get 1.10. It's going to be one of ours, and I know it's really hard to see that decimal there. It doesn't want to let me just do a nice little decimal. So then we also have to do negative 4 minus the square root of 112, and then divide that by 6, and you should get negative 2.43. So we'll just write that over here, negative 2.43. Okay, so 1.10 and negative 2.43. But if you'll notice the next thing on your notes, it says, let's confirm this graphically using Desmos. Let's hop over to Desmos, and we are going to type in that equation, 3x squared plus 4x minus 8. And the equals 0 part, I'm going to show you, we don't actually need to have that part because we know if it's already set equal to 0, I'll show you kind of what that does. So 3x squared plus 4x minus 8, let's type that in. 3x squared plus 4x minus 8. We've already got the quadratic. Watch what happens if I write equals 0. Then it's not even a parabola anymore. And you're going to notice that a couple things when I have the equal 0 or when I don't. There's these 2 points here that don't seem to change, right? Negative 2.431. 1.097, and when I have the equals 0 there, does the same thing, so you get those there. So it's okay if you had the equals 0, if you forgot and you just added it in, but I would just keep it like this. But if you notice, those two numbers right there are the solutions that we got using the quadratic formula. So the reason I point this out is because when you are solving a quadratic equation, and this is important, that's equal to 0, then you are looking for the x-intercepts. So the x-intercepts are what we found for our solutions in our notes, so we know that we're correct there. Okay, so we're going to confirm each of these as we work through the worksheet using Desmos. And from here on out, if you're ever asked to solve by graphing, all you have to do is look for those x-intercepts. So let's look at the next one. 5x squared minus 6x equals 8. Well, it's kind of in, we have it in standard form, but it's not set equal to 0 like we want it. So the first thing we're going to do is take away 8 from both sides. So we would have 5x squared minus 6x minus 8 equals 0. And we can see our A, B, and C values. So here's A, here's B, and here's C. So to figure out what x equals, we use our quadratic formula, x equals negative b. Well, negative 6 is b, so the opposite of that is positive 6. So we're going to say 6 plus or minus the square root of b squared. Now, if I write it like this, and I'll just kind of write it off to the side, if I write negative 6 squared like this, that's wrong. That's the opposite of 6 squared. Negative 6 squared, you have to have that negative 6 in parentheses. And that's going to be what screws us up for the most part when we're working with the quadratic formula, is using our calculators and basically relying on whatever the calculator tells us. If you were to type it in without parentheses, the calculator is going to tell you that the answer there is negative 36. But we know negative 6 times negative 6 is actually positive 36. Just be careful with that. Keep in mind, anytime you square anything, whether it's positive or negative, it should be a positive number for your answer. So just keep that in mind. So we have negative 6 squared, and then minus 4 times A, which is 5, times C, which is negative 8. All of that gets divided by 2A, so 2 times 5. So again, we want to find that discriminant first. So I'll write that off to the side. We knew that negative 6 squared, that's 36, minus, and then we want the quantity 4 times 5 times negative 8. So what is 4 times 5 times negative 8? Well, 4 times 5, that's 20, times negative 8 is going to be negative 160. So you're doing 36 minus negative 160, which is the same thing as 36 plus 160. So our discriminant is actually 196. So the value of our discriminant, that's 196. So our answers are 6 plus or minus the square root of 196. All of that divided by 2 times 5 is 10. Well, the nice thing about 196 is that that's a perfect square. We know the square root of 196 is 14. So our two answers come from doing 6 plus or minus 14 divided by 10. So let's think about that. If you do 6 plus 14, that's going to be 20, divided by 10 is 2, so 2 is a solution. And if you do 6 minus 14, that's going to be negative 8, and then you're going to divide that by 10 and get negative 0.8, or negative 8/10. So we can write that as negative 0.8. So again, let's check that. So 5x squared minus 6x minus 8 is what we want. So let's get rid of this. 5x squared minus 6x minus 8. And let's check our x-intercepts. We have negative 0.8 and positive 2. So it looks like we did that correctly. Okay, so let's keep cruising along. The next one, 7x squared minus 2x equals negative 8. Again, we want to get that in standard form set equal to 0. I'm actually going to write out the work, and then I'll check back with you here in a second, but I want you to try it on your own first. So go ahead and pause the video and come back. Okay, so after you added 8 to both sides, had it set equal to 0, and plugged it in the quadratic formula, the biggest thing that should stand out to you is that you got a discriminant of negative 220. And if you were to type that in your calculator, taking the square root of a negative doesn't work. So in this situation, a negative discriminant, we would have no solutions. And if we look at this equation on Desmos, we're going to see there shouldn't be any x-intercepts. So we're going to look at 7x squared minus 2x plus 8, which I have right here, and you can see it has no x-intercepts. We can see the quadratic opens up and its vertex is above that x-axis, so there are going to be no solutions. So I believe we have one more example. Again, I want you to try it on your own first, so pause it, come back, and compare your work to my work. So after it's set equal to 0, you get 4 plus or minus the square root of 0, all of that divided by 8. So the value of your discriminant here is 0, but we know the square root of 0 is 0. So when you're writing your two different versions, 4 plus 0 over 8 and 4 minus 0 over 8, it doesn't matter. Adding and subtracting 0, those are the same things. So no matter what, all you get is 4, well, plus or minus 0 is just 4 over 8. So your answer is 1/2 or 0.5, however you want to write it. So there's only one solution here. And let's check that over on Desmos as well. So we'll type that in. So you can see I have 4x squared minus 4x plus 1, and I look over here, there is only one point that is actually on the x-axis, and it's at 0.5, that 1/2 comma 0. So the x that gives me a y of 0 is 1/2. So my solution is 1/2. You'll also hear solutions called zeros or roots. So if you're ever asked to find the zeros, you're asked to find the x-intercepts. If you're asked to find the roots, you're asked to find the x-intercepts. So those are all kind of interchangeable here. So going back to our notes, let's kind of finalize some conclusions here. I want to look at the actual discriminant, b squared minus 4ac, and compare it. Well, there were certain situations that came clear through our notes here. One was when b squared minus 4ac equaled 0, then we had just one solution, right? If b squared minus 4ac is less than 0, so if your discriminant was negative, then you didn't have any solution. So the number of solutions you would expect is 0. And if b squared minus 4ac is greater than 0, so a positive discriminant, then you're always going to have two solutions. So just finding the discriminant first is good for you to kind of visualize what that graph will look like and how many x-intercepts there are. So go ahead, do some practice, and let me know if you have any questions.